I'm going to focus now on learning to learn, and I'm going to bring into the discussion a tetrahedral that John Bransford and his colleagues developed that was meant to sort of depict the components that are involved in a child learning to, or a student or ourselves learning to learn. And that is that a person learning to learn not only needs to understand whether they understood something or other, but also needs to be able to understand the task they might be about to undertake, the strategies they might employ for purposes of that task with that material. And his model was sort of served as a frame for sort of focusing upon what we're wanting to have happen in learning to learn. That our goal is to help that person basically be planful in what they do, and to be an active agent in their own learning, initiating appropriate strategies from a repertoire of strategies befitting the task and the material at hand, where the goal in learning to learn is not so much that you can get a child to do this with material where you're holding his or her hand, but what you're aiming for is a child to be able to do that, certainly with you holding their hand, but to go beyond that, to do that for themselves. And that may seem fairly straightforward, but believe me, it raised the ante. Our educational research has shown that we can actually quite easily get back what we give students. We can set up the conditions whereby we know what sort of learning adjuncts that might actually enhance a person's comprehension, but this is a taller order. This is actually you actually aimed at developing a person who is his or her own teacher, own agent of change, and they can use whatever strategies that you might actually have exposed them to, engage them in material other than what you're presenting them, and can do it on their own in a customized, adapted fashion. So how do you pull that off? Some people, not myself actually, but some people argued, well, the way to do that is to do it in a fashion where there's a gradual release of responsibility, where you start off with a lot of teacher modeling and the teacher sort of phases out as the students increase their participation and responsibility. You may call this, as I said, the gradual release of the responsibility model. And from my view, this approach, this gradual release of responsibility, pervades most material, because material can, I think, quite easily be set up for the teacher, present the model. Here, let me show you what to do. Okay, you try it. Okay, let's try it again. This time, try it without me. Where I've been a little reserved about that is I always would prefer it if the teacher wasn't the model, but the students were, where the teacher was capitalizing upon the student modeling for himself or herself. And that's where I would sort of say that this relationship at the point of modeling be a little bit more complex, would be quite a bit more complex, where you're actually encouraging the student to model for himself or herself. This approach, however, works really fine with a couple of the strategies that they started to introduce. Now, again, the strategies were very much focused upon what we were learning from the research, the cognitive research on meaning making, and a number of the strategies were tied with encouraging kids to activate their knowledge. One of the popular ones that was introduced by Donna Ogle was a strategy called KWL. And it encouraged kids before they read or before they engaged in anything, a project or again, a reading selection, to ask themselves what did they know and to chart that out. What did they want to learn? And then have another column there, what did they learn? And this sort of structure, which the teacher would model and the kids would engage in for themselves, it became a fairly simple model by which any of us could approach any material in a way that sort of respected and honoured and brought in our background knowledge. So it was a strategy, again, called KWL. Another strategy, which was a little different because it was a little bit more focused upon the task and the material together, was an approach called QAR that was developed by a colleague, Tafe Raphael, who was a student of my colleague David Pearson and Meg Gallagher, who proposed this gradual release of responsibility. And this was to help kids think about the task at hand, particularly if in fact they're trying to answer questions that they either had formulated or questions that might have been formulated by some guide or by the teacher or whatever. And it was encouraging the students to ask themselves, where am I going to get the answer? And the students, the readers, were encouraged to discern whether the answer was what they called right there in the text, although I'm never sure anything is really right there, or whether it really required to stop and think because it was sort of a combination of the what the author suggested and what the reader would bring, or whether the answer to the question was not in the text and wasn't even, in a sense, suggested by the text terribly well, but the reader was on the reader's own relative to it. And again, you can sort of see the attempt here. We're really focusing upon not just guiding a kid through a selection, but actually being able to really look at the task and the material and analyze it. And we're sort of developing this meta, these meta understandings. A third strategy, which I really was quite fond of for a number of reasons, was a technique called reciprocal questioning. Indeed, I actually prefer an approach not unlike reciprocal questioning, how it was originally developed, to the gradual release of responsibility. And so I would suggest a different approach to the learning of strategies would be something like reciprocal questioning. Now, what's interesting, this second one actually focused a little bit on text, and some of the strategies that I'm not talking about today, but I probably will talk about a little bit next time, really focus upon how kids might enlist strategies to diagram out the text, not like a form of sentence grammar, but the topics and how the topics are related, sort of like flow charts. I won't deal with that today, but let me focus on the reciprocal questioning for two reasons: to demonstrate how it works in contrast to that, but also how it works as a strategy. Interestingly, technique reciprocal questioning dates quite a bit back. It actually was developed by a colleague who recently passed away, Anthony Manso, who received the Dissertation of the Year award the year he did this study, where he was studying at Syracuse with a number of other reading scholars who were interested in content area reading, the reading in the subject areas. And Anthony, I thought, developed this very creative approach to engaging kids in reading any selection. It was called reciprocal questioning. And the way it unfolds is that a child or a student, could be a high school, it could be an adult, sits down with a teacher, and together they read a portion of the text. And then the student asks the teacher questions based upon what he or she's read. And they might be reading a passage about a shipwreck where they talk a little bit about how they're sort of heading out from the coast. And the student might ask a question like where they're leaving from, who's on board. And the teacher would get those questions and would answer them. They're leaving from Southampton. There are 5 people on board. But the teacher will also say, I like your question. Yes, your question gets me to sort of look back to see where this story started from. And so the teacher is, in a sense, extending his or her response to the student in a way to inform the student about, in a sense, the nature of questioning. And subtly, it's maybe a nuance, but I think it's a little directed way, give the student feedback on the quality of the questions, because if the student asks a question which really requires the person to pull together the key ideas, the teacher might say, wow, you're really requiring me to pull together what I think are the key things that are likely to happen. So then after a couple of questions from the kid, the student, the teacher then takes his or her turn and questions the child or the student, and encourages the student to give the teacher feedback. I really like the sort of the teacher and student sort of, in a sense, being positioned together here. And I really like the fact that we start off with the student's questions rather than the teacher's questions. I mentioned that I liked Anthony Manso's early approach to this. Later on, this was picked up by 2 quite famous people in the area of metacognition, Anne Brown and Anne-Marie Palanzar. And I felt like they reversed the procedure. They had the teacher asking the questions first rather than the student. And I always was worried about that, because I'd always, in this gradual release of responsibility, wanted to actually see if we could be in a place where the students are providing their own models. And I think this did it better than others. What's also interesting about this strategy, a little feature that sometimes goes unrecognized, fits in very much with the literature on cognition. And it's a finding that I oftentimes have brought up with teachers. And the goal is to engage in this reading of portions and questioning, taking turns questioning. But periodically, the teacher is expected to ask the student, well, what do you think will happen next? What do you think is going to happen as the story goes on? And at the point where the teacher feels like there's been a sufficient of exchange of questions, and the student is able to give a reasonable prediction, Manso suggests that's a clear indication that student is able to do this for himself, that the student is actively engaged, anticipating what's going on and asking himself or herself questions to sort of mobilize. Ulrich Neisser, who wrote one of the key books in cognition around this time, discusses in there how the ability to predict is a really incredible indicator of the fact that a person is engaging their ideas with whatever material they're reading. And I oftentimes say to teachers, if you want to have a sense of whether or not a student is handling the material, ask yourself, can they make viable predictions? Because I suspect if they're able to make viable predictions, that's a pretty good indicator that kid is handling the materials, handling the ideas, and the flow of ideas. Well, you can sort of see how the focus on learning to learn has played out or is playing out. What I'd like to do next is to take a step back from learning to learn and the other discussions that we've been involved in relative to the approach to teaching reading, and to look at the research question. Given what our interests are relative to students learning to read, how have people asked themselves the question, is this working? And what I'll do next is to discuss different ways that I've seen people sort of look at that question in the context of the researching the sorts of engagements we've been talking about.